The next presentation is going to be by Dianna, Cody, and on the Mayo. I'm sorry. Where are you? MD Anderson experience. Yeah, I know. That one? There we go. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things that's really important is to figure out how you're going to change protocol settings. I'm at a huge institution, and there's a bazillion scanners around and all kinds of opinions on how things should be done. And our policy for changing CT parameters or starting new protocols is that they have to be approved by at least 3 people. They have to be approved by the medical physicist, or there's kind of a team of us. The technologists have to be aware of it, and a specific radiologist has to sign off on that. So setting up the policy is really important, and implementing that change process winds up being very important as well. So this is our operation. We have 13 routine CT scanners. So these are all GE. They're 416 and 64 slice models. We do around 700 exams a day. So it's a very busy operation. They book 3 an hour per scanner, 2 shifts a day, 5 days a week. There are a couple of scanners that are also 24/7 for our inpatients. In addition to those, we have 3 Siemens scanners that are strictly interventional use. So they do image-guided lots of things. We've got 10 scanners that are hooked to Nukes cameras, and they're a mix of GE and Siemens. And then we have a few other things that are sort of spread around. We've got a couple of research scanners in the basement, and we actually are lucky enough that one of our oldest retired scanners is in an educational suite. So we have a CT scanner that's just used for teaching, and we mostly use it for teaching techs, but we also use it for teaching grad students, and occasionally we'll sort of run research experiments, dry run on that scanner before we come in on a Saturday and take up one of the big scanners. So our policy is that we need approval to make changes in writing, and the in the writing part is by email. So we have to, this gets to do a little bit annoying because the lead tech will send an email out saying, okay, we want to make this change. Does everybody agree? And if you kind of lose track of that, she will come back, a million times and make sure that, you're okay with this. Or, on the other hand, she might forget too, and a protocol will just sort of be hanging in midair because 1 or 2 people haven't actually responded to the email. So it's not a perfect system, but the idea is to get everybody's buy-in. If we're going to make major changes, we try and do that gradually. This is a lesson we've learned hard several times, and what we'll tend to do is load up a new set of protocols on 1 or 2 scanners and have the lead technologists involved in testing them, have the radiologists involved in reading the images and deciding whether or not that's good, bad, do we need to make some changes. And once we're pretty set with it, we will roll it out gradually to the other scanners. And we do a lot of CT Tech education. Our CT Techs meet every other Friday. So that's a great time to go in and tell them, oh, we're changing all the pediatric protocols. Watch out for this. Or, we're about to mess with some of the abdomen protocols, and this is why we're doing it. And every time we get the whole group involved, they always come up with really good ideas, really good questions, stuff that we've never thought about. Okay, so I already said that. So we actually, the reason that I'm talking is to explain to you about a couple of in-house programs. This is software that we've developed that actually help us with the whole protocol management process. So the first, and there's 2 of them, one has to do with monitoring and notification of changes. That was the first one that we came up with, and the other one has to do with more of a physics review. So a few years ago, we had this weird thing happen where, and it wasn't the first time, but I remember it very clearly because all of a sudden one day, it wasn't even like over a weekend, just overnight, all the protocols on one of our scanners changed to some previous version many months old. And nobody would confess to doing that. And there hadn't been service there. We just could not figure out how this happened and why. And it caused all kinds of confusion and big mess the next day, trying to figure out what was going on. So we actually developed a program to examine our protocol files on every single one of our routine scanners. And we enlisted the help of a former GE employee who's now part of our PACS team. And Ray was able to come up with this, the software that works really cool. I asked him some details about it, and this is all gibberish to me, but he used Corn Shell, Perl, and HTML. We use FTP to get in and out of the scanner directories, and it actually works. It develops a file, and then it emails us the results. And this cron job runs around 9 o'clock every morning, and it looks at every one of our 13 routine scanners. Actually, more than that, because it also looks at 5 of the PET CT scanners as well. So there's 18 scanners that get analyzed every morning, and what it does is it picks up the protocol file. There's one giant file on every scanner, and it compares line by line, every line, every setting in that file to what we call the gold standard. So this is sort of the previous approved version. And anything that it sees that doesn't match gets output into this file, and this file just grows really long if there's been a lot of changes. And then that text gets embedded in an email and gets sent to our CT physicists. At that point, we sift through this big, long mess and try and figure out what was changed. Sometimes it's just text. It's a label. You know, maybe we fixed a typo. Maybe we changed a name. Very often, they are parameter setting changes, and that's the stuff that we are the most focused on. So the positive results from this software, and we've been running this about 2 years, it helps us really identify typos. So if we meant to say 5 and instead we say 2.5, or something gets kind of backwards and turned around, we check those and we get those fixed right away. It also lets us figure out when changes have been made without prior approval. We just had an upgrade to one of our scanners and have Acer available now on one of the scanners. And one of the lead techs was over there working with the applications folks, and the applications lady said, oh yeah, we're going to change this, and we're all set to do that, and go ahead and make that change. And so the tech was doing what she thought she was supposed to do and made the change, and it showed up the next morning in our protocol list. And she said, what's this? What's going on here? And tracked it down, and the tech had assumed that there had been agreement, and there really hadn't. So that was a very recent occasion when we were able to retract a change that hadn't been made with the proper approvals. And it also really helps us identify when we have older versions of protocols on our scanners. Very often we'll have a service event, and it will be something that requires a wipe of the computer and rolling on the old protocols. And the service guys don't always have access, or some of them don't know they don't have access to the most current list, the most current backup. And some of them may actually look okay. So the tech may not notice it right away in the morning that this has happened, but we will notice it right away because there'll be this big giant list of discrepancies. And we'll be able to quickly let the lead tech know, ooh, we got some big problems over here. We need to get that scanner updated to reflect our current changes. The not so positive results, somebody's got to read the email and got to deal with it. And if you don't deal with it, you get the same darn thing the next day and the next day and the next day. Anything that's changed is flagged, including minor things that we really don't care about. We had no idea how often we would have to deal with this. We were, I think, naively thinking, once or twice a month, it's not going to be that big a deal. Several times a week, we've got things to deal with, and it does take some time to actually work through that. Where's John Wrong? I know I saw you. Okay, can you stand up for me? John Wrong is in the back of the room. John is my partner in crime with this. So if you have questions about these programs, John is another person that you can ask. He actually has to deal with these discrepancies and working through them. The other piece of software that we wrote that's wildly helpful is a lot more recent. This one we just got going in January, and this was because the state of Texas Department of State Health Services recently released a notice recommending that the lead or head technologist at all CT facilities institute a monthly protocol review. We weren't really specific about what that meant, but basically thought this would be a really good idea. So at our place, we elected to make that part of our physics staff responsibility, as opposed to just a technologist job. And we were really looking for the dose-related parameters in terms of our protocol review. We estimated we had at least 300 protocols to review on these 26 different CT scanners, and really wanted to get this going at the beginning of the year. Because there were so many protocols and so many scanners and so many areas, I managed to recruit all of the potentially interested physicists in our group and met to explain the idea and to try and converge on what it is we were trying to do and how we were going to divvy up the workload. Well, the first thing we had to decide was, what is it we're going to look at? Because just like at Mayo, we have sort of two versions of this stuff. The stuff that lives on the scanner and the protocol sheets that the technologists really rely on, because it has a lot more information than just the scanner parameters. And we decided that it made more sense to look at what's on the scanners, because that's what was going to be used. So we really wanted to focus on the settings that live on the scanners. And at this initial meeting, one of our physicists, who was also, nicely, a former GE employee, offered to write a little program to help us do that. And so he went ahead and did that, and it was like a week later he had this thing up and running. So what this program does is the same idea. It goes to a scanner, downloads that protocol parameter, and then it picks off certain fields and loads it into a spreadsheet. And then we can do whatever we want with the spreadsheet. I usually just print it out and scan through it. But before we got to there, we sort of had to figure out really what needed to be done. In our interventional radiology group, these are 3 CT scanners, there are relatively few protocols there, and they rarely get altered. So this was pretty much a nice exercise for the physicist that was involved there, and he kind of went through it, decided there were a bunch of duplicate and old things that they could get rid of. So it was really sort of a cleanup process in interventional. SPECT CT and PET CT, it's very similar. There are very few protocols there. They tend to be midbrain to mid-thigh or whole body. There's a few pediatric ones, but there just aren't very many protocols to look at in our nukes area, and they've been very carefully designed, and we really keep an eye on those. So that wasn't such a big job either. The really big job was the routine scanners, where we have tons of protocols that are frequently altered and can wind up being a big spaghetti mess. So we decided that we would review everything to begin with and then check the ones that made sense more often and leave the other ones alone for maybe quarterly or biannual reviews. So Dr. Tinsu Pan whipped up this program for me, and these are the settings that we're actually looking at the KV, the MA, the rotation time, pitch, noise index, and beam width. And then the very final column shows the effective MAS for that particular protocol. And remember, that's MA times rotation time divided by pitch. So it's at the very far end, and I can just quickly scan all the way through them looking for outliers. And it's made a huge, impossible job, something I can actually do on my own. I don't need 8 people to help me out. He can run this from his computer, so I haven't actually watched him do it. He just sends me the spreadsheet, but it doesn't seem to take him very long. And he used ProScript for Excel format for this. He says that it could also be run actually from the scanner console. So once we got this thing running, kind of had to decide on a process, and what we decided to do was to have an initial goal where we identified those protocols that were over and above an arbitrary limit. And my first limit was 400 effective MAS, which seems kind of high. And indeed, I agree, it's kind of high. We set that at about 300 effective MAS for protocols using 140 kVp. And these were specifically for our average size patients. We have another set of protocols on all the scanners for our large size patients. Those may need to be this high. And so I'm keeping an eye on them, and I'm trying to keep them not too much over 400 effective MAS. But that's not really the set that we were really interested in to start out. For those protocols that use tube current modulation, we're looking at the max setting. So here we're always looking at, what's the kind of worst case situation. In the future, I'm hoping we can dial this back. Maybe next year, maybe later this year, we can look to get everything under 350, maybe under 300, so that we're eventually kind of moving down the scale a little bit. This making these changes and going and asking people, do we really need this much? Can we settle for less here? Which of these groups can we do low dose? Really required both the cooperation of the techs and the radiologists. But in today's environment, everybody was very, very cooperative, and really, I didn't have any pushback on trying to just crank down the dose just to crank down the dose. There are some special protocols that we decided didn't make sense to impose this arbitrary limit on, and especially those patients who we consider large, and we use the display field of view as our size category. So this is patients who require a display field of view 42 cm and bigger are considered in our large group. We also have a number of pancreatic cancer patients where the radiologists read those sub-millimeter thick axial images as their primary read. And those images on any size patient are a challenge. This particular condition has a pretty grim prognosis, and here short-term survival is critical. If they survive long enough to get a second cancer related to whatever, that's actually a good success, because this is a pretty awful disease. Now, having said that, I think we're now getting a second group of younger patients that are getting these pancreatic cancer scans that aren't in that category. So there's another set of patients for whom we're going to have to design a low-dose alternative to this. I think these are patients that have different kinds of pancreatic disease, not necessarily cancer. So how are we doing so far? Well, most of our protocols are now under our initial goal limit, or pretty darn close. In the process, we managed to identify all kinds of garbage stuff that was in there that didn't need to be there. There were a bunch of duplicates, there were a bunch of old things, there were all kinds of stuff that never got used. So we managed to get rid of a lot of nonsense that didn't need to be in there. And I think that streamlining was probably one of the best things that came out of this process. We identified a bunch of inconsistent settings among identical scanners in this process that shouldn't have happened, and I think we're better able to adjust between models to get more closely matched effective MAS. And this program actually allows me to handle this on all of our 13 CT scanners all by myself. Now, what these programs can't do is very similar to what Jim was alluding to earlier. We have this set of parameter settings on the scanners, and we have this set of protocol descriptions that the techs use. And they're different, and we somehow need to synchronize them and match them up. That is a really big problem. Unbeknownst to me, I just realized this like a couple of weeks ago, the CT manager is telling the techs if there is a discrepancy between what's on the scanner and what's on our protocol sheets, use the protocol sheets. So where we had been assuming that whatever was programmed on the scanner is what was going to be used, he's telling them, no, use these protocol sheets. Well, the protocol sheets are, until about now, we're under the control of a single lead technologist, and there were freaking too many of them. She could not keep up with them, and it got to be a real challenge. And there was a period of time a couple weeks ago where the tech team developed their own protocol management group. There's like 4 techs plus this super lead tech, and I didn't know this was going on, but all of a sudden, every day I was getting these emails from this tech group saying, hey, these protocols don't match. Hey, these protocols don't match. Hey, and it got to be, I think they're vying for the most annoying tech in the world or something, because they were driving me nuts with all this. And I started to get to the point where, I was a hair's breadth away from having a hissy fit all over the place saying, no more changes. No more changes on anything until all these protocols match. And at that point, we can go on. But if that means no changes for a month, then there's no freaking changes for a month. I was just this close to blowing my cork. Then I discovered that they had this team thing set up and that they were actually doing this on purpose and not just to drive me crazy. So so I had another frank discussion with the manager and made some suggestions. And my suggestions, we've got way too many protocols to keep track of and not enough people. And so I said, I think what you want to do is divvy up the protocols and make each tech responsible for some section of them so that they will have ownership, that will be their protocol, they will be the ones in charge, they will be the ones to change them, and they will monitor them as they move around. Our techs also rotate around all of our scanners. And he thought that was a great idea. So that's, I think, the way that we're going to move forward. But this linking the parameters to these protocol summaries is a nightmare. And if there's some way we can automate that or make it a lot more transparent and useful, that would be hugely, hugely helpful because it's a complete disaster right now. So my recommendations are that the CT vendors really need to consider these things when designing and implementing their CT scanner interfaces. We need better ways to do this. It's definitely going to be a challenge. Every facility has a different computer infrastructure, and how they're going to adjust for all this is it's going to be tough. So whatever they come up with needs to be flexible and adjustable in a way that doesn't require an IT expert to take care of it every day. But somehow we've got to link up those technical parameters because you can see there's just a lot more information on the protocol sheets than we can logically expect to stuff into our CT scanners. The scanners don't need to know whether or not the patient needs rectal contrast and what brand and how much. The scanners don't really need to know the oral contrast and the timing and the number of bottles. There's a lot of stuff that the techs need to know that the scanners don't. So somehow we've got to link those up a little bit better. I have one protocol story that I can share with you. Our neuro group tends to be sort of independent and really wasn't talking to the physicists very much. And then there were some leadership changes, and then I stuck my nose in and said, I'm not sure we should be doing helical brains I thought it made more sense to do axial brain scans. And they said, why? And I said, well, with helical scans, you're going to get more artifacts, you're going to have more issues. And they said, artifacts? Show me. So I got one of our phantoms out, and I scanned this head phantom the way they were doing it and the way I would do it, and there were no artifacts. And it was like, okay. Well, anyway, I still think you should do this. So I pushed them into making this change, and, well, the other problem was that the way they had it set up, they would have only marginally passed the ACR accreditation for a routine brain. They didn't have enough technique. It was just too wimpy. So I said, well, you got to do that anyway. So while we're at it, we're going to go back to axial. So we made this change, and all of a sudden I start getting these complaints that there's motion artifact. And I'm like, a head scan? What's going on? So I looked at it, and it wasn't motion, it was beam hardening. And it was beam hardening that they hadn't seen in long enough that they forgot what it was. And then, this went on, and they eventually was talking to the head of the neurosection, and he said, our head scans look like they did 20 years ago. They really should look better. There's got to be something more we can do. And I'm like, oh, you kidding me? And he finally pushed me, and he said, I think you should talk to GE, see what they would recommend. And I just had this attitude. It's like, I know these scanners. I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to ask. So it took me a couple of weeks. I dragged my feet. Finally asked GE. And darn tootin', they came up with a combination of parameters that I never would have. So I'm looking at this stuff, and they wanted a very low pitch and a soft algorithm. And, I would never have done that. So I said, well, it's worth a try. So I, went back to the neuro guy and said, we'll try what GE says because you wanted it. And we did it on about a dozen cases, and we could compare the helical to the previous axial scan. About half of the cases, there was just no difference. You just couldn't really tell. There was no improvement. Where there was a difference, the helical scans were better. And I think the beam hardening correction seems to be doing better with the helical scans. They're doing something better than the axial scans. And so we've moved back to helical routine brains, even though I initially told them not to. So that's kind of one story. So if you're not doing helical brains, you might think about that again on a multi-slice scanner, because I think the quality of them is a lot better than I would have predicted. Any other questions that I can answer?
Has there been any concern at your institution when you moved back to helical heads about scanning through the lens of the eye?
No. There's actually more worry about metal artifact off the teeth. But having said that, everybody in my institution is getting a lot more dose conscious. We just in January turned on the dose reporting software, so now all these numbers are showing up on the images, and suddenly that's taken everybody's attention. So folks who used to not pay much attention to dose and technique are now a lot more interested. So it wouldn't surprise me if we don't see a little bit more concern about that in the future.
Some people are debating and saying that the helical gives a higher dose. One of the vendors has been telling people that. Is there any truth to that if you use the proper parameters?
Not that I'm aware of. In fact, the stuff that we've done seems to show that there is a dose penalty with axial scanning as opposed to helical. So I would go the other way.
One last question.
I'll just add that articles came out about doing helical scans of the head and multiplanar reformatting and how much that adds, and actually got a call from some of our neuro people that weren't really tuned into what protocols are being used and said, could we start doing helicals? And I said, well, actually, we've been doing them for 2 years. So a lot of people don't really pay attention to what the protocol is.
That's excellent. Thank you very much.